Hi, my name is Catriona. I am from Dublin and I'm the mammy to two children, Rory 9 and Clodagh 7. Would describe myself as being a total fusspot, an organiser, a little bit OCD in my ways, and having two children to upset that lovely organised life that I had prior to children was a huge hurdle to overcome, let alone overcome the autism piece as well. So a desert island for a week, wow. I would bring music, definitely music of some kind. So I presume if I'm going to need music, I'm going to need a charger of some kind to keep the music. And a nice, easy read book. Nothing complex, nothing difficult. Something that will be light and something that will be entertaining. And a large bottle of sunscreen. I suppose the fact that my children are only 9 and 7, a lot of my life is around facilitating treats for them. And because of the challenges that I have with a child with autism, it's very difficult to travel and go anywhere. But the one place I would love to bring them would be somewhere like Disneyland. I would be happily take Euro Disney, a shorter flight, anything like that as well. But I just would love them to experience the lights, the fireworks, all of them, because both of them would really, really enjoy it. I love to walk. I love to walk. I'm very lucky. I live in North County Dublin and we have lovely parks and I have the sea beside me. And sometimes when I just find things are overwhelming and, that I just need to get out and give myself a bit of headspace, I get out and I walk. Rory, my eldest child, has a diagnosis of autism, intellectual disability. I think we all struggle with the diagnosis when it starts off, and I think sometimes women cope better than men do with the actual diagnosis stage. And also with the living with it. I suppose I was fortunate in that I gave up my full-time job to stay at home and look after the two kids in the last couple of years. And I have been there as the mainstay of the home. So I would be much more familiar with how to manage situations. Sometimes I feel bad because I kind of feel that I expect a lot of my husband to be able to intuitively know what Rory wants or intuitively know how to resolve a situation. But I suppose I have been fortunate enough to be around him so much more that it's instinctive in me. However, COVID and lockdown has allowed all of us to learn more about how to manage both our kids. You know, my daughter, who's neurotypical, she attends mainstream school, she's 7, and she has her own challenges as well, but also been able to manage Rory at 9. Both sets of our parents and our extended family were a lot older. So for them, I'll always remember a member of my family turning around and saying when we told them that Rory had a diagnosis of autism, "Ira, sure, that's nothing. Sure, that's fine. Sure, that's nothing." Another member of the family turned around and commented on, "Oh, there's great supports out there for you. And there's great financial supports." And I always remember my husband saying, "We don't want money. We want a little boy that can talk to us, So, and even to this day, they really don't get it, no matter how much education, leaflets, books you give them to read, simple stuff that maybe would broaden their understanding of the challenges that Rory faces, not so much what myself, my husband and my daughter face on a day-to-day basis, but what Rory faces. So Rory was diagnosed with autism when he was 3.5. We were fortunate at the time because we went through what is called the assessment of needs process, and the waiting time wasn't as lengthy as it is now. Our initial worries and concerns about Rory was that he was very slow to speak. His attention was very poor. I had just had a new baby, so there's just a 2-year age gap between the two of them. And a lot of my concentration and a lot of my time was taken up with the baby. And I wasn't really in the space for contemplating that my child would have any challenge or disability. To be fair, as we went through the process of assessment with the multidisciplinary team and the HSE, it became more and more evident, especially after one particular session, that there was an issue and that there was a problem. At the time when I did get the diagnosis, I remember the psychologist saying to me, "We have no surprises here, Catriona," because we had spoken all about autism. She had asked both myself and my husband, Paddy, at the beginning, when we said we think Rory has autism, she asked us, "So what does that mean to you?" And an interesting point that some parents may find at the beginning of this journey is that two people can live in the same house together and have very different understanding or expectations of a disability of any kind. So when she asked my husband, he said, "Well, I suppose autism for me, means that maybe Rory might have to go to a special school for a couple of years, and then hopefully we'll be able to go to mainstream school." And she looked at me and I said to her, "You know what, I would be kind of happy if you could just call me Mammy." So that is just a prime example of where we were at the initial diagnosis stage. So 3 months down the line, when we did get our official diagnosis, it was no surprise. And I will say, with respect to the psychologist, she delivered what is perhaps the most difficult message to give a parent in the most compassionate way. We went through every emotion under the sun, as every parent does at a time of diagnosis. And quite often, here I am now, Rory is 9, and there's days that I still go through the grieving process and still feel very emotional and feel angry and feel upset and feel hurt and feel love and feel every emotion under the sun. So yes, I do agree with the diagnosis. Rory does have what they describe as a moderate intellectual disability and autism. He is non-verbal and he uses an assisted device, an electronic device, to communicate with me. And I suppose that has been one of the biggest, most positive moves in the last couple of years, that at least it can cut down some of the frustrations for Rory, and that he can communicate in some form with us. It's a really difficult question to answer because there are so many things. Every article you read, every website you look at, people talk about, your expectations of the child that you thought you were going to have, and ultimately then you didn't have. I suppose initially in the beginning, I found the biggest difficulty was that everything was work. Everything was hard, everything was a challenge, everything was an ordeal, from feeding to sleeping to washing to dressing. Everything was a chore, and you do it out of love, and you do it out of pure love and affection, and like every mother does for their child. And then I suppose for me, I started to maybe resent the fact that I had to do so much work with my child. And it's a bit like I alluded to earlier, the jealousy bit. I look at other parents. I remember walking outside Temple Street, bringing Rory in to have his eyes tested. And I remember seeing a guy walk along Temple Street roaring at his child, who was probably around Rory's age, screaming and roaring at him to hurry up, to follow him and to pick up his coat. And the little fellow was saying, "But Dad, I wanted to show you this," and da, 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 da. And I remember thinking, I want to go over and just tell you, stop screaming at your child. Your child can follow you, can pick up his coat, can talk back to you. And I remember feeling so angry and so annoyed with him. So I think the hardest thing for me initially was in the beginning was the fact that everything was work. Everything was hard. The hardest thing for me currently now is still having a child that hasn't called me Mammy. But a positive side of that is that because Rory uses an electronic device, we're now having small little breakthroughs. I was at a doctor's appointment with him last week and he wanted to go. Like, he went in, he charmed them all, he batted his big brown eyes at them. And next minute he sat and he looked over at me, and I had taken off his jumper and it was on his lap, and he picked up his electronic device and he went, "Mom, Mom." He scrolled through, picked the picture of me, and it was Mom. And I said, "Yeah, Mommy's here. What do you want?" And he went, "I want help, help. Mom, help." And I said, "Sure, what do you want help with?" And he threw the jumper over at me. So whilst Rory can't verbally communicate with me, he uses his electronic device to communicate with me. And that is huge. And that for me makes up for all the hard work. Therapies that Rory has received predominantly have been therapies that we received initially through the HSC. So obviously it was a multidisciplinary approach. It was occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and psychology input. Rory has absolutely no gross motor skills. He climbed out a top bedroom window when he was 3 years old, not the side window, the small little fly window. So he is very mobile, very much able to move. So we didn't need any physiotherapy input. So we did have speech and language therapy and occupational therapy. Now, I will say this to every parent, especially for those that are at the beginning of their journey. You are your child's speech and language therapist. You are your child's occupational therapist. I had so many mixed understanding, or I was misguided in my expectations of what the allied health professionals were going to provide for us. But in fact, all they can do is teach you as a parent what you can do to help your child. Now, that was a big hurdle for me to overcome, because I was kind of thinking, I'm exhausted, I don't sleep, and I have to do all of this extra work as well at home, and try and cook a dinner, and try and look after a small baby, and I have a husband coming in from work, and an elderly dad and mum, and I was kind of going, man, I want a bit more help here. But of course, again, it takes time for you to understand that actually the best person and the best placed person is you, or your partner, or your husband, or your wife, to actually do all of the interventions with your child. So the early intervention team with the HSE was our initial port of call, and then we prayed for some private therapy as well. But again, a lot of it we waited with time, because as with all things with the autism diagnosis, every child is different. Every child responds differently to treatments and therapies. And so Rory, as I said, was diagnosed when he was 3.5. At that time, we were doing home tuition, which was a nightmare. I will safely say it was a nightmare. So we had this fantastic girl doing home tuition with Rory inside in the front room of our house. Myself, my husband and my little girl were in the kitchen listening to Rory screaming, not wanting to be sitting down or doing any form of work, any form of play. He was not in that realm at that point in time. I got a phone call from Abacus School in Kilbarrack, where we had applied for a place for Rory, and we were number 62 on the waiting list. In those days, they had a waiting list. And they asked me, did I have my official diagnosis document? So this was just at diagnosis stage. And I said, I have a one-pager, but I don't have the big thick complete document as yet. And I was asked if I was still interested to drop up the application. So my husband dropped it up the next day, and we found out that the school had been approached by the Department of Education to open an early intervention class. They were taking on 6 children. My husband asked where would Rory be on the waiting list for early intervention, and he was number 7. Now, that was nearly worse, being told you were so close to perhaps getting your child into a structured environment, because there were no preschools in my area that had the skill set to meet Rory's needs. Anyway, by natural attrition, some of the children that they had on their waiting list had dropped off and had been placed. And Rory actually was one of the first 3 boys to go into their early intervention class in Abacus. It was called the Busy Bees, and they were all boys and they were all busy bees. And he was 2 years in early intervention. And by the luck of the gods or whoever, the divine intervention, the school could only let children progress into their main body of their school once they had a number of boys or girls, but predominantly boys, leaving the school at the other end. And for us and for me and for 3 other parents, the year our boys would have been leaving early intervention, 4 children left. So there were 4 places for our 4 lads, and 3 of them are still in class together. One little boy did progress on to mainstream school, and you know what, that was nearly like a grieving process as well for us, because we kind of went, oh man, he's done so well, he's now gone to mainstream. I'm still in touch with his mammy and he's still struggling in mainstream, and he still has the issues around making friends and socialising and having buddies to play with in the yard, and so whilst we would look on and say, oh, he did so well, he has his own issues as well in mainstream school. Now we are blessed. Rory has a place in Abacus until he becomes an adult, until he's 18 and has to go into adult services. So we are blessed. Okay, so meltdowns in the beginning, I hadn't a notion. I hadn't a notion of what was causing poor Rory to get so upset. So 2 years ago, he became, as I said, particularly aggressive, violent. I really didn't know what was going on. Hadn't a clue. Now we've gone down the medication route, which was a huge thing for us to come to terms with as well, starting Rory on medication. But in the interest of his own health, his own well-being, in the interest of his sister's well-being, and in the interest of myself and Paddy's well-being as well, we came to the conclusion that we needed to get more help. And to be fair, I have to say it is, whilst it's been a very bumpy road with trying different medications and all the different side effects, and again, you know, isn't it the story of our lives? It's perseverance with everything, and you try and you try something, and if it's not working, be honest with yourself and be honest with the healthcare professionals that are trying to help you. And if you say, look, I really don't think this is working out for X and Y and whatever, because a lot of Rory's behaviours, I hadn't a clue what was triggering them, why this was causing him. And for some, on some occasions, there was no reason. It was just the really bad space he was in at the time. Now that he's 9, he's a little bit more mature. We've got somewhat a little bit of balance on the medication front as well. I now know when his behaviour is escalating. I can now see it coming. I can now see when, okay, it's drizzling rain outside, we can't get out for our walk just yet, but I can see him bubbling. I can see his level of agitation, his desire and his need for some kind of intervention. And I use intervention in a broadly term, as in it could be push him on the indoor swing that we have in the house, or get Clodagh to lie on top of him with the cushions. And sometimes that doesn't work. He's pushing us off and you're kind of saying, okay, he doesn't want that. Bring him over to the table, try and do a jigsaw, try and do a wooden puzzle, do something that I know he'll get a positive out of, that he has completed something. Sometimes that doesn't work either. But you know that it's going to cause holy war if he doesn't get out and just simply go for a walk. It's about learning about your child and to be patient with yourself, because that takes a long time for you to learn and understand what's causing your child to get agitated and restless, and what are the measures that you can do in order to prevent that meltdown. So the biggest thing at the moment that would cause Rory to get upset and to have a meltdown is refusal. So if I refuse to give him either food or a drink or the activity that he wants, he will go bananas on a particular day, at a particular time, not always the way. Quite often I can say, no Rory, there's no 7-Up available now, I'm sorry, or no Rory, no chips now, I'm sorry, because again, he will ask using his electronic device. And you know, 50% of the time I'll get away with it. 50% of the time I won't, but I have to distract him. I have to give him something else. I have to give him a substitute. And that is a learning process for us all as well, to try and work out, so what's going to get me out of this situation? What can I do to avoid this turning into a disaster? I'm still learning every day, every day. So food for Rory is an issue because he has a hugely limited diet. He is quite typical of a lot of children that you will hear on the spectrum. He's a bit of a carb loader, like his mammy, and he loves bread, pasta, wheat, whatever else. And it's something that we beat ourselves up about. Do we give them enough protein? Do we give them enough vegetables? Is this impacting on his development? I have now learnt quite interestingly that it's, Rory loves a crunchy food, something that he can bite into. So if the toast isn't done to the desired standard for young Mr. Rory, it gets pegged back at me across the kitchen table. I got it this morning because the toast was like the way I would like it, nicely toasted. But for Rory, it wasn't to the required standard, so he wouldn't eat it. Having said that, if I put a beautiful soft brioche in front of him, which has no sensory input when he puts into his mouth from a hardness, crunchy, biting perspective, but it does fill out his cheeks and he likes that sensation. So again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but a lot of it is a learning process for you as a parent as well. That he may favour crisps because they're crunchy, but chickatees because they kind of soften, melt in your mouth, nah, not really. However, skips because they kind of pop when he put into his mouth, he likes them. So it's phenomenal. We could write a book on children and eating, and I'm sure many people have written books on children and eating that are on the spectrum. But yes, I am aware that there are he has certain requirements, and you do have to try and meet that as well if you want to get some form of nutrition, because Rory goes from 0 to 100 and in the hunger stakes. He goes from, I'm fine, I'm grand, I'm satisfied, to hangry, as we call it in our house. Like, he's angry, he's hungry, he's cross, he's going around looking for food, he's seeking it out. And you're desperately saying, wait, pasta's coming, good man, good waiting. You're doing great waiting, Rory, well done. And you're going, oh God, pasta, cook quickly, So, you're trying to balance it all. But yes, he would have certain issues and sensory issues around food and eating. So York was the most beautiful animal that came into our house, and we were full of very positive expectations. We went through quite a lengthy process. We went through the Irish Guide Dogs in Cork. So they are quite different to other organisations. They give you a fully trained dog. You don't have to train the dog yourself. So I went down for 5 days to Cork. We went for a pre-assessment prior to that. We as a family went down. They met us. Big lengthy process. We were accepted. We got this beautiful dog. I brought him home after 5 days of training in Cork. And for a year and a half, he was the most positive thing that came into our family. I suddenly was able to go out with my 2 children. I'll always remember the first day I went and I walked in Howth with Rory and Clodagh. And I walked the full length of the pier. I came back. So Rory was attached to the dog and Clodagh was toddling alongside him. And I walked the full length of the pier and came back. And I actually went into a little shop that had 2 little tables and a cafe, and I sat down. My kids had a snack bar each and a drink each, a Robinson's fruit shoot. I can still see it. I had a coffee. And I actually took photographs because I said, I have never done this. And then unfortunately Rory hit a really bad period from a behaviour perspective. He became quite violent, quite aggressive, a lot of self-harming, a lot of self-injurious behaviour, a lot of attacking his little sister, so much so we had to change the car because I had to separate them in the back of the car. And also the poor dog then started getting the brunt of it. And it was a huge amount of stress for us as a family, because every time I wanted to go out, Rory would reject the dog. He didn't want the dog. So I suppose it's important to say that very clearly you were told, quite often people have an expectation the dog is going to become your child's friend. I was told at the very outset, they may never have that relationship. The purpose of your dog is to keep your child safe so that you can go out and walk, especially considering Rory was such a massive flight risk. So we tried it. We had him a year and a half. Unfortunately, the dog became quite stressed in Rory's company, and Rory became quite stressed in the dog's company because he saw it as a restrictive encounter as opposed to a positive encounter that he had viewed it as for a year and a half. Now, unfortunately, it was perhaps due to the moment that he was in from a behaviour perspective and emotionally, and we had to resolve that before we could ever resolve the issue with the dog. And the priority was to resolve Rory's issues and not the. Sadly, York went back to Cork after being a year and a half in our house. However, I now walk with my son, not attached to a dog. He will hold my hand. Now, not all of the time, but he will never move too far ahead of me. I say that tongue in cheek because I really wouldn't trust him. He could still bolt on me and he could still run, but we would never have had that experience if I hadn't had the training for Rory with York. So you would walk to the footpath, you'd walk to the edge and you'd say wait to the dog. And that clear direction to the dog, Rory was taking in as well. He knew he had to wait. So repetition, repetition, repetition. And Rory now would stop and wait and hold my hand and we'll cross over the road. And, you know, while some people would say, oh, it didn't work out for you and it's a pity it failed. It didn't fail. It just didn't work out for us. But it did work for a year and a half, and what we gained from that year and a half has been hugely beneficial to us now. And it was a big thing for us to have to give up the dog, but quite like I said about, you know, occupational therapy or therapies, you know, don't flog the dead horse. If it's not working for you, take a big deep breath, because in fact, ultimately the dog was causing myself and my husband a huge amount of stress. Because it became another job, another chore for us to do, to walk the dog, to feed the dog, to groom the dog, to bring him to the vet, to get him vaccinated. And you know, when you're dealing with a child that's going through a horrendous time behaviourally, another job is the last thing that you need. But it was fabulous for the length of time it worked with us, and we ultimately have gained from it. So my Eureka moment, I can think of one very recently. Last Sunday, we brought Rory to his, what I call, it's like tag rugby in our local rugby club. It's a special group for children of all disabilities. This is our third season. The first season was all about just getting Rory onto the pitch, being around other people and to be able to tolerate them. The second season, he screamed, he roared, he didn't want to be there at all. My husband actually said to me, oh gosh, is this really worth pursuing? And I said, yes, it is. I said, I really genuinely believe this is worth pursuing. Bearing in mind what I've said, Rory was going through a really bad period that time, behaviourally as well. And we went back only in the last 3 weeks because of the COVID restrictions. And this week, Rory managed not alone to throw the ball at one of the coaches, but also catch it and follow instructions. So much so that I actually had to take a video of it. I was overwhelmed because Rory has always been able, I suppose to put it into perspective, he's always been able to throw items of everything from underwear to balls to household items, over walls, into other people's gardens. I was knee deep in a river in our local park 2 weekends ago when he threw his actual electronic device that it communicates with into the river. So, you know, throwing is not a problem for Rory, but it was never purposeful and it was never intentional to cause a response. So last Sunday, he and two of the coaches engaged with each other where the coach was saying, Rory, to me, follow me. So he would throw the ball to the coach, who would throw it to another member of the team, who would then throw it to Rory, and Rory would then throw it onto them. So not alone was he throwing, he was also catching, he was following instructions, he was listening, his attention, his concentration. It was a magic moment. I described it as a magic moment. There's an old guy who sings called Perry Como, and he has a song called Magic Moments. That was my magic moment last weekend. To start my journey all over again, the biggest piece of advice would be to be patient with yourself. It's really difficult to be patient in challenging situations where your child is having meltdowns and you have so many other competing demands, whether it's other members of the family, other children, your extended family, and all of the day-to-day family life that goes on. All of our lives are incredibly busy, even in the current times with the pandemic. Life is still busy. But I think to be patient with yourself, Perhaps put away that big stick with the nails in it that you beat yourself with at night for not doing enough for the kids and not doing enough for your husband or not doing enough for your wife. And I think to cut yourself a bit of slack. And it's going back to the one message, I suppose, that I have repeated in all of this interview, is that when you're trying something, don't keep trying it just because you've been told to keep trying it. Try it, know your child, know their limitations, or not so much know their limitations, know their ability and what they are able to do and able to participate with. Don't expect too much of them, because ultimately if you expect too much of your child, I think you ultimately expect too much of yourself as well. And this is a long road and a bumpy road. And if you're to survive this, and I don't mean to use that in an exaggerated fashion or in any way dramatic to say if you're to survive it, but if you were to get the most positive experience out of life living with a child on the spectrum, you have to cut yourself a bit of slack and cut them a bit of slack. I'm not saying you excuse their behaviour. I'm not saying that you excuse a tantrum as opposed to a meltdown, because that's another learning process. I'm not saying that you can sit back on your laurels and do nothing and say, oh, I'm exhausted, I'm too tired, and I'm not going to do this. Yeah, you can do that maybe for one evening, but you have to pull your boots up, pull the socks up and say, come on, tomorrow's another day. Let's just shelve today. It just didn't work out for us today. But to be patient with yourself and be patient with your partner as well. I think when we hit rough times, we always lash out and hurt those that are our nearest and our dearest. And sometimes we expect too much of them as well. And when you're caught up and consumed in the moment of trying to make everything better for that one individual child, or whichever, if you have a few children with disabilities in your family, you sometimes lose sight of the fact that you're a family unit, and everything impacts on the family unit. So be patient with yourself, be patient with your children, be patient with your partner, and know when to take your foot off the gas. That's what I would say to myself. Just know when to take the foot off the gas.